All right. So good afternoon, Professor Ryan. We are Team 5, and we are going to be presenting today on performance incentives. So just real quick, based on what we've learned about performance incentives, driving success in a modern organization requires aligning the performance of thousands of unique people with their own priorities, goals, and dreams to execute a complex strategy and vision. While effective management and leadership can create a shared vision, incentivizing employees through other means can further align employee behaviors with organizational goals. So we're going to look a little bit here to start at the value of incentives and why companies may use incentives to help with performance. So employee incentives programs are generally used to increase workplace productivity and help companies reach their performance goals and generally achieve their strategic objectives. And the programs, as we've seen kind of going through all of our research, these programs are also used to help improve employee morale, well-being, and also increase or improve external perceptions of the company. So traditionally, performance incentives have included cash bonuses, profit sharing, stock options, and maybe even some organizations offer prizes. But what we've seen is that there's a growing body of research on incentives that shows that monetary rewards do generally motivate people, but employees increasingly value non-monetary rewards like flexible work schedules, greater responsibilities, and even public recognition for a job well done. What we found is that performance incentives can be given or be determined at the company level, the team level within a company, or at the individual level, but that a lot of companies actually do some sort of mix of all those different performance incentives. We've also found that when companies are putting together their performance incentives, that those incentives need to be clearly defined so that there's a direct correlation between performance and incentive payout. And we found that employees are generally more motivated by performance objectives that are clearly defined and predictable. Another area that we researched during this project was that highly successful incentives programs not only reward employees for short-term results, but also incentivize activities and behaviors that help a company advance its long-term strategies. And we found that well-designed incentive programs should seek to retain strong employees, attract highly qualified new talent, and generally align employees' behaviors with the company's mission, vision, and profit goals. So with that, we're going to now hear from Daniel about the different types of rewards and incentives that companies can provide their employees to improve performance.
So at a high level, as part of our research, we researched a couple of different general categories of incentive plans and different upsides and downsides to those plans. So the first off being casual incentive plans. So this includes things like spot bonuses, gift cards given in, and other things that can be done in near real time, and that goes all the way to include things like a immediate show of appreciation, right? Obviously, the compensation doesn't necessarily have to be financial. The benefits to this is they're cheap and they're very easy to set up. It doesn't require great foresight or a lot of structure to establish a plan like this. It allows for immediate recognition of a job well done. One of the pitfalls of a lot of more structured incentive plans is when they're established on a quarterly or annual basis, it's easy for certain employees to feel like those rewards are disconnected from the effort that they're putting in. So pitfalls include subjectivity, right? Obviously, anything that has a human element to it can lead to some level of bias, and some important behind-the-scenes contributions can get missed pretty easily, as well as the appearance of favoritism. The structured incentive plans tend to be the first thing that comes to mind. Things like sales commissions programs or incentives for reaching revenue targets within a division or team or a group. Those sorts of plans, they remove the immediate human element from decision making. They're established in advance and can kind of appear to reduce the favoritism in the plan. But they're complicated, they're expensive to administer, and they require constant management to ensure that employees aren't exploiting them or focusing on the 2-meter target that may or may not actually be the desired behavior for the company as a whole. And then finally, group incentive plans. So things like profit sharing, company ownership, any plans where the success of the entire company is passed down to the individual employee. This helps encourage employees to be bought into the success of the company as a whole. It helps helps ensure they stay aligned and helps keep employees bought in. Some challenges with this, and we saw this, with Southwest in recent years as their growth has stagnated. Employees come to expect this as part of their compensation, and while they may, as an individual, continue to perform at the same level, industry trends or other new competition can cause their incentives to be reeled back. That doesn't feel fair. It can cause a lot of frustration, as well as employees that are less strong contributors get rewarded the exact same way as the strong contributors, as long as the company continues to perform. So with this understanding of general incentive plans and categories, I want to talk a little bit about some of the considerations that come with incentive plans in general. Financial plans are often one of the first things that's discussed and thought of when thinking of incentive plans. But they come with some pitfalls and some considerations that are worth talking about. These sorts of plans tend to focus on items that follow at the lower end of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So they may not provide substantial value, and they can also have actually some negative impacts on employee performance as well. So we'll discuss a little bit more impacts on intrinsic motivation. Study after study has shown that employees perform best when intrinsically motivated rather than extrinsically motivated. That's difficult to tap into sometimes, but in a lot of cases, employees may even come in with some natural built-in intrinsic motivation that can actually be crushed by a poorly designed extrinsic plan. These plans can discourage positive risk-taking, and most companies need to have long-term goals and long-term focuses, which are very difficult to incentivize. And an easy example of this is Kodak, and at the beginning of the digital transition, short-term incentive plans for an employee at Kodak might encourage the development of new film products or pushing sales in existing territories. There's no incentive plan that reaches out and encourages somebody to be thinking about the market shift towards digital photography. And so when a sales team and a product development team is focused on those short-term goals and heavily incentivized to focus on them, they can miss the long-term big picture considerations. Another caveat is most reward programs ignore the why of good or bad performance. And what I mean by this is an employee that performs well on paper, it may be due to having a good territory or being lucky in that particular year, or vice versa. And a lot of times these situations can create frustration where employees that are not actually very good are heavily rewarded, and employees that are performing well but up against a tougher task might not be positively incentivized. And then finally, all of those downsides can lead to impacts on culture and how employees feel aligned. The whole purpose of a reward program, as Justin discussed, is to get employees in alignment so that you have a large organization full of individual people marching in the same direction. When you start to see these cracks in the plan and things fall apart, that frustration can lead to employees being pushed in the wrong direction. And all of these downsides really just cover the assumptions for employees that are well-intended and fall strictly within the bounds of legal. I think certainly we're all familiar with the recent Wells Fargo effects of an incentive plan gone wrong, where employees created fake bank accounts for customers. Obviously, that's an extreme case, but just further exemplifies the risks of a poorly designed incentive plan. So what we found in our research is cultural and personal incentives tend to offer the best value for an employer and the best effect on employees. So this can be things like flexibility, alternative work hours, alternative tasking, allowing autonomy, right? And this can be things like the Atlassian Ship It days or the Google 20% time. This allows employees to take advantage of time to chase after things that are of personal interest to them. And they often benefit the company as well. Google's 20% time has been the source of a number of great products since then, Gmail among them. And so there's certainly upside for the company in that as well. And then finally, recognition. A simple pat on the back or a handshake, appreciating a job well done, often goes a lot farther than many people give it credit for. So all of those incentives that cultural and personal incentives kind of tend towards the intrinsic side of the scale. And so Brandon's going to discuss here a little bit more extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation.
All right, thank you, Dan. What we see is that when we want to tap into that personal, more direct and focused kind of motivation and understand better what each individual person needs, we kind of have to start to understand the difference in between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic can be thought of as the carrot and stick model. These are driven by outside forces. So whether the application of the reward is going to be, or whether someone is going to receive a reward versus whether they're going to be punished for behavior. What we see is that studies that have been done to kind of reflect this. In Sweden, there was around 150 female blood donors that were given 3 options. The first was to be able to volunteer. The second was to be able to be paid for their donation. And the third was to be able to be paid with the immediate need or the immediate option to be able to donate to a children's charity. What one might think is that the people who would be paid more would be more likely to donate. But just the opposite was actually realized within that study. Kind of more along the lines of the stick. In Israel, there was a situation where parents were picking their students up or the kids up from school late. And so to kind of curb this behavior, they wanted to be able to do something like fine the parents for being late, and thinking that would curb the behavior. But what actually ended up happening is that the parents started to feel entitled to be able to come wherever they wanted to if they were okay with the fine. Kind of the opposite of what we really wanted to see. So you can see in these 2 examples, extrinsic motivation is kind of one of those things that may work some of the time, but not the majority of the time. But I also want to be sure to note that where extrinsic motivation actually really does have its place, and that's on the lines of physical improvement. There's a study shown where people would shoot free throws, and the more free throws you can make, the more monetary incentive you could receive. So within that situation, the more money that was presented, the harder people would practice and work to be able to get things done. However, when you transition into more of a role where thought patterns make sense, where you need to be more creative, more innovative, these are type roles where the monetary incentive actually brings on stress and can be barriers to innovation. Right? So on the other side of the coin, we have intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic are going to be those things that are driven by the interest of the task at hand, and they're not reward based. So these could be things such as the work itself, or understanding that someone is promoting someone's passion, kind of those cultural and personal, more of those cultural and personal kind of feelings. So the biggest thing around understanding that personal incentive kind of model is diving into the individual and trying to figure out what is going to motivate them. 2 ways that we can definitely do this the best is understanding Herzberg's motivational hygiene theory and also McClelland's need theory. Herzberg states that the things that satisfy us and motivate us are different than the things that dissatisfy us. But what does this mean? So if you look towards the bottom of the chart, these are things that employees or individuals expect. Improving things in this area can only get that individual person to a neutral kind of level. What we want to do is to be able to cater towards things more on the motivational side. So this is the job satisfaction. So understanding that people, there are ways to motivate people with the work itself, maybe opportunity for growth within a position, or making the work itself more challenging and tapping into the gamification or mastery kind of feel, right? Once we start to understand where those areas are and what's going to motivate people on an individual level, then we can start to group them and understanding McClelland's need theory, and that everyone can be addressed, their needs can be addressed in three main categories. This is your achievement, affiliation, and power needs. So power is the need to be able to influence others. Affiliation is going to need to be accepted by others, and achievement is going to be more on the lines of setting goals and being able to obtain those goals. So in combination of these two kind of theories, you get a better understanding of the individual and where your team may fall within that power, affiliation, achievement kind of bracketing, to be able to then create a incentive plan that's going to work for your team or organization. So next, Luke will be able to take us through just what it's going to take to be able to implement an intrinsic incentive plan.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. So yeah, so my peers have discussed the different types of incentive programs, such as extrinsic, intrinsic motivation theories. So moving to point step 2 would be implementing this program. So we divided this up roughly into 5 groups: structure, formalization, promulgation, motivation, and value. Okay, so when we think between these 5 categories, we think you can implement a proper program that can really cover what you need to have. So for structure, this is important. It can be neither too simple nor too complex. It's got to be easy to understand, but it's got to cover sufficient facets of the program. If it's too complex, no one's going to take the time to read it, look at it. And so if you spend all this time making a program, no one's even going to, look at. But if it's too simple, it could be too open-ended, too encompassing, and the program will lose its value because no one really knows what's going on. There's a lot of questions. It's too open interpretation. So to find that middle ground is really important. And of course, the structure of your program is going to have to reflect the industry department goals. One would expect a center program of a regional marketing campaign or a marketing firm of 50 people would be much simpler than conglomerate GE, all their many departments. So it's got to reflect the industry you're in. Okay, and there's also the case of a program that's too complex. It will cost more money than a simpler program, but we believe that some complexity is required, and that's necessary for it to succeed. So for the next one, formalization. This is to lend dedication to the program. So if a program seems lazily crafted and not thought out, employees are less likely to be involved. I've dealt with this firsthand. My second tour, actually, I came in. There were numerous programs that were pretty much word of mouth. You perform your maintenance, you do this, then you're good. And what ended up happening was that after a month or two, these programs would fail because no one knew how to reference it. They didn't know what their requirements were, and there was nowhere to really go reference this program and where it came from. So they always fail. So putting it in a written form that's easily trackable, that's easily accessible to people is incredibly important. And it really conveys to the employees that the management took the time, they're serious about the program, and they want you to take it seriously as well. Okay, so for promulgation, essentially just communication. Okay, so you want to ensure fair and equal access to all aspects of the program, because if certain programs don't seem fair, like there was some people have an in with management, someone at the top level, they have insider knowledge of what's coming up, or then employees, when they get word of that, are less likely to be involved. So it has to be a fair and equal access. There can be no favorites. It's got to be a meritocracy. Because employees will soon get to the point where it's like, well, if I'm not going to be considered at all because Joe over here has an in, then why should I even try? So it's an important thing to realize. And it also has to be done with energy. So a lackluster rollout, it won't show to the employees that that maybe the management in the company doesn't have the full faith in what they're doing. They think it's probably a check in the box. So if you have energy and a vigor when you implement this program, then it conveys to the employees that you really care. Motivation. So if a program seems cheap, that the employee is not the focus, it's all about the company's bottom line, it's all about lining some pockets, then the employee is less likely to accept the program. The program has to come from a place where the employee is the center of it. Now, it's not to say the incentive program is not to improve the company, which is usually the case, why they implement these programs, so it can help the company, but it cannot be the sole reason that the program is implemented and created. Okay, so it's got to really focus on the employees. And lastly, we have values. So all the incentives, benefits, they all have to be valuable. And this doesn't always come with a dollar sign. In fact, it probably usually doesn't. But we have to make sure that the incentive program is crafted so it captures most of the employees of what they want. It's also have to take on board the group aspects of the employees. So, and this is actually probably this is actually more important than the individual goals, because if you focus on the group and those incentives, then that frees up time and it helps the individual understand the individual aspects more. They can have more time to focus on their individual goals and incentives for what they need to have. So yeah, we believe those five pretty much wrap up proper implementation. I'm now going to cede the floor to Nathan. He's going to discuss measurement metrics of making a successful incentive program.
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, to ensure the success and the longevity of any sort of incentive program, it is important for the company to find some sort of metric to measure, to quantify, to ensure that success. So to measure some sort of financial incentive, you use US dollar. But as we've discussed in this presentation, these extrinsic motivation factors don't necessarily motivate or turn into good performance from the employees. It's more the intrinsic values that matter most to them, such as purpose or power or affiliation. Does one measure the intrinsic values of an incentive program to ensure the success of it? So the goal of the company is to find that right metric and to quantify that metric to monitor the success of the incentive program on a consistent basis over time. So I'm going to give an example of how to measure purpose as one example of intrinsic value. And one way to measure that is using the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, as seen on the right here in this presentation. This short scale measures the self-esteem and purpose of an individual. It helps the company to get a quick assessment on how the employee is feeling within the company, what the kind of purpose they have, how they fit in, how happy they are, how they feel about themselves working for their company. So the company must figure out how often should the employees take this assessment. Once a year, monthly, maybe even weekly. Really depends on the values of the company. It depends on how big the company is, what direction and vision they have. So there's not one correct answer of how many times to take such an assessment, but that's something for the company to decide. So as we move to the next slide, I would like to talk about other metrics to consider to ensure the success of an incentive program. A company can look at the turnover percentage, for example. If their employees are leaving quite often, or the length of time an employee is at their company, they might need to change the incentive program or fix it in some way, because obviously they're not motivating their employees to stay with them. Looking at the satisfaction of the employees is another thing the company can look at. And there's many other things they can measure as well. The company must also be aware that they might have to adjust the incentive program to fit certain departments within the company. It's important to have a universal basic structure, as Luke was saying, to implement so it's predictable and people understand what the incentive program is. We might have to adjust certain aspects of it to fit different needs of the employees. People within sales, may have different values or interests than someone in engineering, for example. So you need to adjust to their values and to their needs and to their desires to the program to make sure you satisfying the employees. All of this is measure what matters, because it matters what you measure. the company can have this awesome incentive program. It could be perfect, but they'd be tracking the wrong metric, and this will cut short the longevity and success of that incentive program. So it is important to measure from the beginning the correct metric of that incentive program to ensure its success. I'm going to pass it back to Justin so he can look at the key points and wrap up this presentation.
All right, thanks, Nate. So now that we've presented our research on performance incentives, we'd like to provide a brief recap of the key findings. So we noted that incentives programs are critical to the success of many businesses. And we didn't cover it to much of an extent, but it could also be critical to workers at nonprofits as well as in the government sector. We noted that many companies often fail to develop the right mix of incentives that support short-term targets and long-term goals, as well as strategic objectives. I think a key point is that if companies wish to develop incentive rewards to long-term goals and objectives, then they should generally focus on providing incentives that correspond to the higher end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, especially esteem and self-actualization. So that was covered by Daniel a little bit earlier. But we found that developing these really well thought out programs it's challenging, and especially at large firms with lots of employees. Generally because it requires a lot of investment, a lot of research, a lot of planning. But those firms that do endeavor to create these types of programs need to be able to succinctly define the structure of the program, formalize the reward scheme, ensure fair and equal access, be able to motivate employees, convey the value of the incentive program, and then when it's all said and done, be able to actually measure the results of the incentive program and be able to make changes or adapt the incentive program based on the findings or based on the results that they've seen and how those results align with their goals, objectives before they started the incentive program. So with that, Professor Ryan, we hope that you've enjoyed our presentation on performance incentives. I think as a group, we've definitely gained an increased appreciation for the difficulty of developing effective performance plans or performance incentive plans, and really just appreciation of the sheer amount of work and planning that goes into developing these plans. And so we really look forward to your feedback. So thank you for listening.